Philippines strongly protests the recent approval by the State Council of China of the establishment of the so-called Wangyan Island National Nature Reserve. Bajo de Masinloc is a long-standing and integral part of the Philippines, over which it has sovereignty and jurisdiction.
黄岩岛是中国的固有领土，建立黄岩岛国家级自然保护区是中方主权范围内的事，旨在保护黄岩岛的生态环境。
When China announced plans to create a marine nature reserve at the disputed Scarborough Shoal, it sounded harmless, a gesture of environmental care. But in Manila, alarm bells went off. For Filipino defense officials and veterans of the South China Sea struggle, it felt like a ghost from the past had returned. They'd heard these words before: research facility, fisherman's shelter, environmental site, and they'd seen how those phrases had ended. With radar domes, runways, and missile platforms on reefs that once belonged to them. That's why, this time, the Philippines is determined. Scarborough Shoal must not become another Mischief Reef. Armed Forces of the Philippines Chief of Staff, General Romeo Brawner Jr., made the warning clear. Once they build a structure there, that would be a different story. We are watching closely so that we will not have a repeat of Mischief Reef. His words carry the weight of hard-earned history. In 1995, under the presidency of Fidel V. Ramos, Filipino fishermen and patrols discovered unfamiliar structures rising on Mischief Reef. Bamboo and steel huts perched on stilts, flying Chinese flags. Beijing insisted they were shelters for fishermen seeking refuge from storms. Manila protested, but the response was diplomatic ambiguity and a promise that the outposts were temporary. They weren't. Over the next decade, those modest shacks evolved into fortified platforms. By the early 2000s, China had expanded the site with communications arrays and concrete facilities. When tensions briefly cooled during the friendship diplomacy, years of the Arroyo and early Aquino administrations, Chinese engineers quietly began reclaiming land. Then, between 2014 and 2016, a fleet of giant dredgers transformed Mischief Reef into a massive artificial island. Roughly 1,400 acres of reclaimed land, larger than 500 football fields, a 3-kilometer runway, radar domes, hangars, and anti-aircraft missile sites soon followed. The reef, once little more than coral and tide pools, became one of the most militarized features in the South China Sea, a floating symbol of Beijing's new maritime power. Legally, the story was clear. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled that Mischief Reef lies within the Philippines' Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ, and continental shelf, making it indisputably part of Philippine maritime territory. The ruling also declared China's occupation and land reclamation activities unlawful. But on the water, the reality was brutally different. The Philippine flag was gone, replaced by radar towers and red runways. Today, Mischief Reef stands as a monument to how slow, patient expansion, carried out under the veneer of civilian facilities, can change the map without a single shot being fired. It remains a fortified symbol of China's defiance, and a painful reminder of how easily sovereignty can slip away when vigilance falters. In July 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, PCA, in The Hague handed the Philippines a historic legal victory, the kind that should have reshaped the map of Asia. 3 years earlier, under President Benigno Aquino III, Manila had taken the unprecedented step of bringing China before an international tribunal under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Unclose. It was a bold, lonely gamble, a small Southeast Asian nation challenging the world's rising superpower through the rule of law. When the verdict came, it was sweeping. The tribunal struck down Beijing's 9-dash line, the vague boundary that claimed nearly 90% of the South China Sea, as baseless under international law. The court went further, declaring Mischief Reef part of the Philippine continental shelf, affirming Manila's sovereign rights to its resources, and condemning China's island building as an unlawful violation of Philippine jurisdiction. For a brief moment, euphoria swept Manila. Newspapers ran front-page headlines declaring, "Justice for the Philippines!" Diplomats spoke of a new era of accountability. It was hailed as a triumph of law over might, the classic underdog victory. David against Goliath, and David had won. But on the water, the reality was starkly different. Mischief Reef remained covered in concrete and Chinese flags. The court's ruling had no enforcement mechanism, and Beijing simply refused to recognize it.
As one senior Philippine naval official admitted privately at the time,
It's impossible to evict the Chinese there. This will take time, not in the next 5 or 10 years.
Manila understood the limits of its victory.
With Chinese warships patrolling and dredgers still operating across the Spratlys, any attempt to forcibly reassert control risked escalation, and perhaps war. Thus began the softly approach. Filipino officials hoped diplomacy might temper Beijing's anger. There was also quiet fear that too much public pressure could strengthen hardliners within the People's Liberation Army, forcing Beijing into even bolder actions. "We should find ways to allow some face-saving actions," one naval officer said. "We don't want the CCP overthrown by the more hot-headed people in the PLA. That would be too dangerous."
Beijing, meanwhile, projected triumph.
It dismissed the Hague ruling as null and void, insisting it had no binding force. Within days of the judgment, Chinese state media ran a full-color photo on the front page of the People's Daily, a civilian aircraft landing on the newly built Mischief Reef runway, twin red flags fluttering in defiance. It was more than propaganda. It was a statement of power, that concrete, steel, and sovereignty had already replaced coral and law. The world could debate legal texts, but on the reef itself, the verdict had been decided by dredgers, not judges. For Manila, the 2016 ruling remains both a badge of honor and a scar of helplessness, proof that even when justice is served, it means little unless nations can defend it. Nearly a decade later, the same story appears to be unfolding, this time at Scarborough Shoal, or Bajo de Masinloc, a traditional Filipino fishing ground just 120 nautical miles from Zambales. China's newly announced plan to turn Scarborough into a marine nature reserve sounds innocuous, even noble, but for Manila, it carries a chilling echo of history. This is the very shoal that sparked the 2012 standoff between Philippine and Chinese vessels, a tense maritime chess match that ended with Beijing taking effective control. Filipino fishermen, who once freely cast their nets there, suddenly found themselves blocked by Coast Guard cutters and water cannons. What was once a quiet coral atoll turned into a symbol of lost sovereignty. Since then, Chinese surveillance ships and barrier nets have become permanent features of the lagoon.
The shoal, long part of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone,
Is now patrolled and fenced off in the name of marine protection. To many Filipinos, that phrase feels like deja vu. The same words used at Mischief Reef before the bulldozers and dredgers arrived. Philippine officials have called the Nature Reserve proposal a clear pretext for occupation. General Brawner, mindful of the scars of the past, has drawn a firm line. We have several options. Diplomatically, we could file protests, but we are watching closely, he said. Once they build a structure there, that would be a different story. His warning carries not just military weight, but historical memory. The Philippines has seen how slow, quiet steps, a fishing shelter here, a Coast Guard buoy there, can snowball into a fortress of steel and concrete. And for many in Manila, the question is no longer whether China will move, but whether the world will once again look away when it does. For Filipinos who remember the mid-1990s, the name Mischief still stings. Back then, China's first wooden huts, said to shelter fishermen, appeared quietly within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. When Manila protested, Beijing called it a misunderstanding. A few years later, concrete towers replaced the shacks. By the early 2000s, radar dishes glinted under the tropical sun. The pattern was clear, but the world barely noticed. Regional observers called Mischief a potential flashpoint, and they were right. It marked the moment the South China Sea dispute turned from a legal debate into a contest of possession and permanence. Today, Mischief stands as a grim monument, proof that international law without enforcement is merely parchment, and that delay can be as dangerous as defeat. That's the nightmare Manila is determined to avoid at Scarborough Shoal, before another reef is lost not in battle, but in silence. For the Philippines, this is not just a diplomatic issue, it's existential. The nation is walking a razor's edge between asserting sovereignty and avoiding a confrontation that could spiral out of control. After the 2016 Hague ruling, then Defense Minister Delphine Lorenzana described China's mood bluntly. They are a bit angry now. Emotions are running high, and we don't want to provide them any reason to react violently. Those words captured the cautious tone of the Duterte administration, which sought to befriend Beijing while quietly preserving defense ties with Washington. It was a pragmatic gamble, one meant to buy time and peace. But that friendly approach saw little restraint from China. Instead, Beijing solidified its positions in the Spratlys and tightened control around Scarborough Shoal. Now, under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Manila faces the same dilemma, but with a different strategy. Marcos has shifted course, replacing quiet accommodation with strategic transparency. His administration has chosen to expose Chinese gray zone tactics to the public and international community, rather than hide them behind diplomatic language. At the same time, Manila is building deterrence without outright provocation. Under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, the Philippines has expanded U.S. access to 9 military bases, several of them facing the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. It's also fast-tracking naval modernization projects, from BrahMos missile batteries to corvette acquisitions, while deepening security partnerships with Japan, Australia, and Vietnam.
It's a balancing act as old as the Republic itself.
Between defiance and diplomacy, between independence and alliance. Each move must assert sovereignty without lighting the fuse of conflict. In many ways, the Philippines' fate now hinges on how well it can walk that narrow path, firm enough to stand its ground, but wise enough not to stumble into war. Scarborough Shoal is more than coral and sand. It's a mirror reflecting the South China Sea's central truth. Might still outweighs right. For generations, Filipino fishermen from Zambales and Pangasinan have cast their nets in those calm turquoise waters. They called it Panatag, meaning safe, a place of livelihood, not conflict.
That peace shattered in 2012,
When a tense standoff between Chinese maritime vessels and the Philippine Navy ended with Beijing seizing effective control of the shoal. Since then, Chinese Coast Guard ships have patrolled its lagoon, often blocking Filipino boats from entering what international law recognizes as their traditional fishing ground. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled decisively in Manila's favor, affirming that Scarborough Shoal lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone and branding China's blockade illegal. On paper, it was a victory for the rules-based order, but on the sea, Chinese ships never left. Beijing rejected the verdict, and in doing so, rewrote the rules through presence, not principle. Now in 2025, as China unveils plans for a so-called marine nature reserve at Scarborough, Manila's warning that the shoal must not be militarized feels like the last stand of restraint. The stakes have never been higher.
For the Philippines, this is not merely about territory, it's about the credibility of international law itself.
If Beijing begins construction, it won't just mark the loss of another reef. It would expose, once again, the limits of justice in the absence of force. The question now hangs heavy over the waves. Can the Philippines, armed with alliances and legality, hold its ground? Or will Scarborough, like Mischief before it, become yet another monument? Not to what was taken, but to what the world allowed to slip away.
If you liked the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.